Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the APICS stage, Steve Georgevitch.
Thank you. Thank you. So to start off with, my wife noticed this. I don't know if you guys noticed, but I have the very same suit and tie on that I had when I had my picture taken last year. So I don't know what that means. Actually, Douglas could probably tell you what that means, but thank you very much for inviting me here to speak this year. It's definitely an honor to be here. I wear two hats. Obviously, I have a day job at the Boeing company, but I'm also the chairman of the board of APICS. And suffice it to say that it makes for a long day, and there's a lot that takes up my time and energy. I just want to give you guys a quick introduction of myself. I started at the Boeing company 30 years today. In August. 30 years in August. And I started when I was 23 years old, which makes me 34. It's actually it's a grandkid joke there. My grandson still says my wife is 34, even though my daughter is now 34 as well. So, and she doesn't argue with him. So just a little bit about myself. I started the Boeing company, like I said, 30 years ago, and it was actually a little bit by accident. I got out of the Marine Corps, and my first job was a supply chain job. It was driving a fork truck, picking stuff off of the back of the truck, putting it onto another truck. It was for a company called Yellow Freight. Didn't know it was supply chain at the time, because 30 years ago, none of us knew it was supply chain. Then I got on at Boeing, again, just by accident. And my first job at Boeing was the same job, actually. I was driving a fork truck. I was, again, freshly minted out of the Marine Corps. Didn't have a formal education. I just finished through the 12th grade, but had not started university. And so it was definitely and I was happy. I loved driving a fork truck. And how I got into supply chain, my first real, what I would call white-collar job or office job, was my job was, again, driving a fork truck. I was responsible for anything that got finished in my area. I would pick it up and take it to the next area, and then I would go back to my area. That all the stuff that came into my area, and I would order all the tools so that my expediter would tell me to order for the area, and then I would take those and I would order them, and then I would go match those up with the jobs, and then they would run those jobs. Well, one day, my expediter took ill, and he was on long-term leave. And I said, every day I order all these tools, and then I got to go put them out on all these different orders. And the fact is that no one's going to work these today. They're going to work them in 2 days or 3 days. And so why am I ordering all these tools like he always had me do? I'm just going to order what I need for today. So I was already kind of in this just-in-time mentality that said, I'm going to only order for what's being queued up for the day. And and it was great, because my job got really easy. I was always having to kind of shift things around and restructure them every day, and now I'm all of a sudden now kind of doing this just-in-time. And then I'm going down to the work center before mine and say, hey, don't run any more jobs, because I don't need those yet. That when they come to my area, they're just going to sit. So why don't you guys stop running those jobs? And the guy in that area said, hey, the guy before him, why are you running all those jobs? Because you're queuing them up in my area. And so soon we kind of had a little almost shop floor revolt going on, because all of the material handlers are going, why are we doing this? Why are we operating this way when we should really kind of be doing more of a just-in-time type of philosophy? And so one day my expediter comes back from sick leave, and needless to say, he was not happy with the fact that I was now, one, doing his job, but two, is I had screwed everything up, because it kept everybody busy, and this was all busy work, and we were no longer doing busy work. So our boss came down one day and he said, you should really probably come off the shop floor and become a scheduler, because that's what schedulers are supposed to do, and that's what you should probably start doing. And so, and it was funny, because I was actually getting paid more driving a fork truck with overtime than I was getting paid in the office. So it became my first office job. And I guess all that comes to kind of play into the fact that I think I've always had a supply chain brain. I just can't help myself from doing supply chain. And so that started my career. And What's interesting about how then my connection with APICS and how I got to where I am today as far as the chairman is, so fast forward a few years, and now I'm running all of the scheduling for the Fabrication Center and Sheet Metal Center, and we're going to put in an ERP system. And so and I don't know what ERP is, but we're going to put one in, and so I've got to figure out what it is. So I go to the local university and I said, "You guys know what ERP is?" And they said, "Yeah, we do. It's supply chain. That's what supply chains do." And so I said, "Okay, well, you guys need to help me. We need to train my people to know how to use ERP." And so spend a lot of time working with the university to kind of get them set up to do that. And then I've heard about APICS and what APICS could train people to do. And so that was my very early stages of kind of getting introduced into APICS. I was starting from that point, I eventually became chairman of the board of the Supply Chain Council. Then I was chairman of the board of the Supply Chain Council when we started the merging activities with APICS, and now I'm chairman of APICS. So, been an incredibly blessed career for me. I'd say none of it has been of my own demise. It's pretty much handed to me, and now, as a good steward of that, I'm now kind of trying to figure out how I'd help build supply chain professionals going forward. So what I'm going to talk about is the state of supply chain and where APICS is going in response to that. We started, I want to say it was 2 years ago. We had a board of directors meeting, and we also had a bunch of people that we invited to talk about where is supply chain going and what's the future of supply chain. We've all heard Sean talk about this frightful future of robots taking over the world, and there's this reality. There's some reality to that, but there's also this reality of the fact is that there's a world full of people, and those people are really kind of what are the supply chain. And no matter what, I think that, I don't see us all being taken over by robots sometime in the near future. That doesn't mean we don't have to be responsive to it, but there are things that we do really have to think about. So just put this out on the table right away, because it's been almost mentioned in every session I've sat through, is, I come from the U.S., you can probably figure that out, and the U.S. pulled out of the Paris Accord, and that's really important, right? That's something that's important to us, that most Americans, we really care about that issue. And what's part of then, that has a lot of repercussions on what we do as supply chain professionals. What you're seeing in the U.S. right now is actually some organizations, some states, California and New York, have both said, we know that the U.S. at the country level has said that we're not going to respect the accord, but we're going to still enforce those laws. We're going to actually bring legislation that's going to drive those changes into what we do. So those global trends are really, really important. That the Paris Accord has all kinds of implications on all of those that decide to participate, and we need to understand what those mean to us, along with some other issues I'm going to talk about. So we all got together and we started looking at what are some of the macro trends that are going to affect us as supply chains. Now, some of these you're going to see are exactly what you've already seen in some other presentations. So I'm going to try and make sure that I talk to how we respond, as opposed to just trying to put the fear of God into all of us and say, oh my God, we all should go home and go to the casino and just bet it all on 9, and hopefully we hit it, and then we can all forget about all these problems or buy some robots, right? So some macro trends that we're seeing is the rise, so we call it the rise, and it's the rise of these, what we think macro trends, and then the response that we think the supply chain is going to have to these. And we kind of broke them down into two things. One is demographics, and the other is technology, and I'm going to go into some further definition of those. But when you think about the rise of urbanization, so I want to say it's by 2025, the estimate is 843 people not only will be living in urban centers, but of those 843 million will actually be living in substandard, impoverished types of conditions, in urban type conditions. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about this when I talk about urbanization. But another issue that's coming at us is the rise of the young and the elderly. I had someone talk to me earlier about the fact that what do you do about millennials who don't want to stay with your organization, that want to be very upwardly mobile? What's the response that we have to have? I kind of counter that response with the fact that you're going to have people that are going to be working for you sometimes now until they're 70 years old. And what's the other, there's some issues that we've got to contend with, both the young and the elderly in the workforce of the future. The rise of Africa, it's interesting that you don't hear the word conversation about BRIC anymore, or BRICS. It's now, but Africa has not fallen out of the conversation. So Africa continues to, from our point of view, to be a very, very important part of the future of the globe, and the industrialization of Africa and the ability to really bring economic stability, drive economic growth for the rest of the world. I mean, ultimately, we all get some benefit from that. And the rise of women in the global society. Interesting, I guess you guys are, if you follow politics, the latest trend of the Middle East kind of moving away from Qatar, or Qatar, however you guys pronounce that. But really interesting macro trends there. And what's interesting is that these folks that are willing to align with Saudi Arabia for all kinds of different reasons. And who's Saudi Arabia? So I don't want to go into the politics of that, but Saudi Arabia in and of itself is a very interesting part of the world. But these alignments that are being created and what the implications of those are pretty fascinating. The second part is technology. And again, you've heard so much about technology. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I would say is really the important parts of digital in the supply chain. And I'm not as fixated on, again, the robots taking over the world as much as I think there's a lot we need to do as supply chain professionals around response to digital. So when we talk about digital, there's our technology, autonomousness, intelligence, data, transparency, fully conscious consumerism, and that's enlightened consumers as a function of the internet and information being given to them, and then the rise of the speed of change. And again, that was, I think Sean really got you guys kind of inspired on that topic. But I think that the change, we can't all be afraid of change. And if you say go back to, again, the beginning of my career and some of the things that we stood in the face of me when I was coming up in the ranks, and actually if you go to our parents and our grandparents, the world continues to change dramatically, but we've never had to stand in the face of World War II. We've never had to stare into the face of the Cold War and nuclear proliferation. Well, I guess North Korea is changing that game too, right? So again, some interesting kind of dilemmas that I'm going to talk about. So demographics, fascinating statistics here. So really some compounding problems. And so this is from the context of 1950 forward. So since 1950, infant mortality is down 300% in the world. Fascinating statistic. And then we're living longer. So we're living 15% longer. So life expectancy is up now 15% around the world. Interesting. I think that that's changed in the U.S. as a function of some health habits. But the fact is we're getting older and we're getting younger. And I'll talk about this in a minute, but has some fascinating implications of that. 3 billion people have been added to the global population, so we now went from 3 billion to 6 billion people since 1950. The global population has slowed now, so that trend is now backing off. But what is the most important part of that is the most growth is in the developing countries, and Africa is one of those developing countries. And if you look at particularly in Europe and Asia, there's a demographic problem. We will never turn the corner in Europe and Asia in terms of repopulating those countries. The economics can never turn to having a fully developed population because of how long people went with only having 1 or 2 children. So the replacement rate was very low. That is not the problem in Africa or Latin America. So the fact is that the population has continued to grow in these parts of the world. And as you can see, countries like Japan and China are right now facing kind of economic disaster. And you can see that there's a response in the economy right now around that. The fact is that those parts of the world are facing some degree of implosion. And in Europe, you're seeing that's why Brexit is happening. Who knows what the next, Germany is still being very loud about what they might do next. But it's a game changer for us, and what's really important about that is two things. One is, how do we bring in this youthful generation into the workforce? So the average age of the African in 2025 is going to be 21 years old, 20 years old. That's a pretty young age. And how are those folks going to be ingested in the workforce? But the other part of that problem, and this is the question that gets asked to me a lot, is, so what about those people? I'm going to talk about millennials, but millennials have in fact, I think even on the next slide, millennials are these continuous learners, team players, collaborators, diverse, optimistic, achievement-oriented, socially conscious, highly educated. 2020, they'll be 46% of the workforce, but they don't like to stay. And so the retention rate of millennials is very low. If you ask the average person I've talked to in this room has said, I can't keep my millennials, particularly my high-performing millennials. What do I do about it? And so I got the secret. You guys have, and now I'm going to be a billionaire, right? Because we're all trying to figure it out. I'm lying to you. The issue is that to some degree we've just got to deal with it. So there's the fact is that you have to bring a lot of millennials into the workforce because you're going to have to plan for them to attrition out. And then the ones that are really, really strong millennials, you have to give them incredible opportunities. I have a couple people that work for me today. And they kind of give them boundless opportunities. I've had them in front of our own CEO and given presentations to them. I've kind of put them on the hot seat. They get really challenging assignments because my point of view is that if they're gonna rise, I need to give them opportunity. I need to push them into places where they really have to have some opportunity to kind of test themselves. And I can't do that to everyone. So that's, again, I'm going to bring in a lot of folks. I have 6 interns that have just started working for me while I've been in South Africa. They all report to me, and I kind of watch them throughout their whole internship. And I look for which one is going to be the high flyer, the accelerator, and how am I going to go and invest my time into that person, because it's really critical that I figure out how to make them launch. So the other part of it is, though, that don't forget, you're only going to get about 5% of your workforce is going to be a new workforce every year. And what are you doing about the rest of the people that work for you? Because that's where APICS comes into play. That's where SCORE comes into play. How do I drive that? How do I work with that? I'll call it dilemma. But again, I think one of the things is it's like there is no magic bullet to this. It's really going to be focusing on the high performers, being prepared for attrition. Don't freak out when they go. And then also investing in your mature workforce, because if someone's going to, and accommodating them, because if someone is going to be working for me till they're 70 years old, there's a different set of issues, of domestic issues that I'm going to have to deal with as a consequence of that. So there's no, I don't believe there's a magic bullet for the millennials. People are making good money off of the conversation around this, but there is no magic bullet. Yesterday's workforce won't lead you into tomorrow. And again, when I say that, yesterday's workforce, when we think of it, it's, okay, we're going to bring in the millennials, and we've got to figure out how to actually utilize them in the workforce. But the other part of that that's really critical is, again, what do I do with someone that's 55, 60, 65? Because we tend to kind of say, put them on a shelf, they're on the path to retirement, yet there can be brilliant people that work for you, and the fact is you're focusing all your time on trying to retain the millennials that are going to go either way. So I think it's really critical, maybe I'm just saying this because now I've turned over 50 and I'm going, hey, this is me now. But I think we're way over fixated on purely the millennial workforce. But change your workforce, invest in your people. When someone turns past 50, think about what it is that I'm going to continue to invest in them to keep them growing so that they can be productive people in my organization. The other thing is, who are my supply chain superheroes, and how do I make them truly superheroes? How do I give them assignments that make them, that test them, that push their boundaries, that make them do things that they didn't think they could do on their own? When I think about my own personal experience, my real learning opportunities have been when my boss said, I don't know, go do it yourself. And when I did that, and it's terrifying, and you're going, how do I do that? I mean, I don't have the skills. But I did, and I figured it out. And so I think that's really critical as we think about people and who those superheroes are. And again, a superhero doesn't have to be 18, 21, 25 years old. Digitization. So I'm not gonna park here because you've heard so much about this. When we think about what the impact of digital technology on the supply chain is going to be, I think, again, we're way over fixated on robots and Amazon, and I think there's so many different other contending points. I did find the statistic kind of interesting, though. So over 90% of people, all organizations today, but closer to like 95%, it looks like 92%, have a web page. Let's see now. When did the first businesses, I don't know what the day is, but first businesses didn't have web pages 15 years ago, really. I mean, the average business. So it's kind of interesting that the statistic starts in 2014. But the fact is most organizations today present themselves to the world in a digital form through the internet. But the other part that's interesting about that is they really just present themselves. They don't transact through the internet. They don't transact through their web page, the e-commerce view, the omni-channel view of the world. It's not a reality because it's highly promoted, but I think it's one of the things that we really need to change our headset about. Is that my portal to the world of my product, of insights into my business, and how do I use that? Somewhat in competition to Amazon, again, and you guys don't have the Amazon phenomenon like we do in the U.S., but the fact is that is the view into the world, into my products, and how do I get transparency to interesting issue in the U.S. It's really fascinating. You order a product online, and one of the things that really that immediately starts to happen is people start rating your product. You kind of get peer reviewing of your product, and eventually, you start to see that the market takes over really quick based on social interaction with your product. It's great. One, two things. It'll challenge you to perform. The other thing is it'll kick you out of the market if you don't. But either way, the idea that you expose yourself through the internet is really, really important. And how do you leverage your business inside of the internet? The second thing is high-speed broadband communication and that connection speed that you're getting into your business. Something that, again, we're thinking a lot about how we're presenting to the outside, but how hard we're driving our organizations to have the highest speed internet connections and the ability to get broadband into our business is critical. Because it changes the game in terms of how you can respond to your customers, but even just as importantly, how your business responds internally. So it's a really kind of fascinating kind of statistic to me. But one other kind of, what is a digital supply chain? And I'll give you my point of view, definitely not an authoritative point of view. But a digital supply chain is really essentially your business, connecting all the business partners in the supply chain digitally. Now, that's but the bigger deal about that, and I'm going to tell you why I think this is so critical and we miss it so much. When I say digital and digital representation of myself into the market, how do I define my customer in digital form? Who is my customer and as a digital entity? That it's kind of complex of an issue, but I need to figure out as an organization, how do I say that you're Mr. A, you're Mr. B, you're Mr. C, and when I start dealing with customer A, I see these types of behaviors, and I can start to categorize my customer in certain ways, and I can have insights into that customer, but I have to be very precise in terms of how I define who my customers are, who my suppliers are, how my supply chain operates in digital context. And that's a really, really complex problem, and particularly when you you sit down with your procurement organization and you say, who's that supplier? And they say, well, it's Joe. Joe's Acme Manufacturing. Okay, there's 15 different Acme Manufacturings in the procurement system. Which one is it? Well, it's all of them. Or no, it's those two, but not that one. Okay, when I say Acme Manufacturing, do they all do the same thing? No, they do 15 different things. Okay, how do I tell the different things that they do in a way that I can see digitally? And that's really complex. That's really hard stuff to do, but unless I get that kind of insight, the idea that I can start to parse out who my customers are, how they behave, how I want to respond to them, how my products are consumed in the market, how they compare those to other products, it's that digitization, that digital representation. We call it a digital twin in the aerospace industry. It's the idea that we can represent everything that goes on in the world in digital form. So that means that everything has to have a digital identity, person has to have a digital identity. An organization has to have a digital identity. Their products and services have to have a digital identity. And I need to be able to attribute those to different things that I can then use to make decisions. Again, it's very complex. It doesn't, and when you get into these conversations, again, supplier management goes, look, leave us alone, right? When you tell us when we create a new supplier and you have to give us, and we put in this code, don't make us go fix this or that. It's supplier, it's Acme. You know, we know Acme. I don't need that information. I know who to call. And I go, well, but I need to know more about that supplier. I need to have that insight into that supplier, and I don't need to try and farm through hundreds of thousands of pieces of information to discern that. Call it master data management. I don't know if you get who's familiar with the term master data management. Really, really critical term. And master data is ultimately the key to the digital era. If you can't master your data, you really have the dilemma of trying to make sense from information that doesn't make sense. And again, how many of you guys have suppliers that, in your procurement system, you can see the same supplier 15 different ways? Anybody have that problem, or is it just a Boeing issue? Oh, well, we're in trouble. You guys are in great shape. Globalization. So the idea of this, again, this global community, I talked a little bit about this again, so let me ask you this. Who every day goes and scours the news for what all is going on in the world that could affect your life and supply chain? Do you think you do? Nah, the average person really doesn't. My experience, right? And you say, well, do I really need to do that? Well, it's amazing when you start to, and in fact, let me ask this question. Does anyone get the APICS newsletter? If you get the APICS newsletter every week, Abe has an article in there. Abe doesn't write it, by the way. I can tell you, just to out him on that point. And in fact, the ones that come from me, I don't write. I do have insight into them. I do review them, but there's a lot of people that help us write those. But what goes on in the world has effects on all of us today. It's a connected world. I mean, we talk about globalization, but yet we kind of all localize everything. But again, what's going on in the Middle East, from my perspective, is a huge deal. Because we sell products in the Middle East. We have suppliers in the Middle East. So everyone throws Qatar out, but then the next thing you know, what's Qatar going to do? Well, they're going to align with someone else, and they're going to start throwing somebody else out. And the whole and by the way, we're selling, Boeing is, I'll just say this too, Boeing is selling products to all those different people. And sometimes we're selling products to people that we'd have to say, I'm not sure I like the idea of that. But in this connected world, we all need to understand what is going on and who's affecting me, even if it's second order, third order, fourth order, fifth order. And so I can't say that enough about that. And now the other part of it is, this demographics change, but this other part about, so you got demographics, urbanization, and now you've got this globalization and this connected world and this technology that's got everyone connected. I was just listening a little bit today about the latest attack in London and how much intelligence they had, again, on some of these issues that were going on. And most of it was a consequence of patterns on the internet. And so there's this technically connected world. There's a lot. We're going to see more and more oversight of technology. You're going to have a lot more people that are paying attention to what's going on in this technical world. And the other part of that is that we're going to have a lot more bad actors that are trying to get into our own technology. So, an interesting problem we have, particularly in the U.S., is Chinese manufactured components that have embedded spyware, and it's fascinating how advanced the Chinese are, and the fact that in electrical components, they can embed a lot of powerful technology that can actually go and spy on what's going on in the environment that's around them. So if you want to be freaked out about anything, the world of microelectronics is a scary world right now. What can get ported onto a chip, embedded into a chip, and what those chips can do is a daunting problem. So the fact is that in this technically connected world, great and bad part about it is, like I said, that chip has embedded software. Sometimes it has communication technologies that can speak to that connected world, get to a Wi-Fi access point, send it back to somebody, again, that's a bad actor. And so, that's, to me, is actually more of the scary part of the world than the robots. The robots aren't probably going to try and crack that code. So these technical advancements and these demographic changes, these geopolitical issues, they all have an effect on us. And we're the supply chain folks. We touch it all. We had in an executive summit, we talked a lot about the fact that we touch the business end to end. And we have insight into that end-to-end set of business processes that go on. And we tend to kind of have a soft voice in the business. And the fact is that we have insights that are really, really powerful, and we need to kind of seize those opportunities to speak out. I talked about this a little bit, but it's a fascinating problem we're going to come up against. And in India again, in Africa, it's a big challenge, which is the infrastructure challenge. If you ask me what my three things that keep me up at night that have nothing to do with robots. One is geopolitics. Two is infrastructure, and the fact that we're lagging in terms of infrastructure development across the world, not just a South Africa issue, not just an Africa issue. The world is not developing infrastructure at the rate it needs to continue to support economic development. And the third one, which everyone says it's not an issue, is energy. Actually, South Africa, I think you guys have a very strong respect for energy, but the rest of the world, I think the U.S., we're back into the state of there's plenty of energy to go around. We have all the fossil fuels that we need. But the fact is that the fossil fuels are depleting resource, and wars have been fought over oil, and I predicted another war will someday happen in the future over oil. So those are the issues that keep me up at night. But the other part of it is we talk about this urbanization. I talked about it earlier. Is in this world of this concentrated urban challenge, I'll call it. The infrastructure that goes with it, schools, particularly the ability of schools to keep up, and I think in South Africa it's a particular problem. The ability for the educational system to keep up with the population. Because, it's just, there's just so many people coming into the education system that the idea that we can educate everyone in these really highly dense urban populations is a dramatic problem for us. And how are we going? And this one I don't have any idea of an answer for, but this is a huge, huge challenge for us going forward. And so when I say infrastructure, I definitely include school systems in that. I think government's another one, and the government's ability to respond to this. And then you have South Africa, and and actually so what's good news is I did a Google search and just kind of said what's some of the major news in South Africa, and there's some things about talent gap, energy, and some of the energy challenges. Obviously there's political issues, there's some issues around the ports, but really it's in terms of South Africa, it's actually a pretty calm economic climate and business climate and political climate, but obviously, you're not without your own internal challenges. And again, I think the one thing I continue to find when I research South Africa is the educational talent development education is a challenge, and getting folks through the educational system is a challenge. And again, in highly concentrated populations of people, it's a challenge to educate. And again, it's all part of this dilemma of one is a population that's coming into South Africa. Two is the fact that people are concentrating in very urban areas. Someone mentioned this. Was it China's the 14th, or South Africa's the 14th province of China, or something like that? Have you guys heard that? But I captured this, and this was so. You guys there's a rail system that was built. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this rail system, but it was built by the Chinese. It was engineered by the Chinese. Over 6 years to develop $4 billion worth of Chinese financing to develop the railroad system. Now, that said, there's infrastructure there as a consequence of that. And the fact is that you don't owe the Chinese anything because it's your country. So I think that. But this idea, by the way, the majority of the U.S. debt is owned by two organizations. One is the actual taxpayer, the U.S. citizens, hold the second most amount of the U.S. debt. The majority of the U.S. debt is held by China. So the fact is that they're everywhere. The Chinese have hooks into the entire global economy. Is it all bad? Good question. But it's good that we know that. I think it's important that we know that. But the other part of that is going back to the fact that the Chinese are, should I say this broadly, but there are some parts of some factions of China that are very interested in understanding a lot about what goes on in the world through ways that I would say are not transparent. If that's maybe that's the best way to put it. But again, we're connected. It's this connected world, and we sometimes miss how some of these pieces all match up. So I'm going to tell you a little story about the Boeing Dash 80 to give you a little context, my favorite way to give context to the Boeing company. So July 15th of 1954, a guy by the name of Mark Allen bet the entire Boeing company, essentially $15 million on the Dash 80. It was the introduction of the jet airline into the commercial, so the ability to move people by jet airplane, started in 1954. And what was interesting about that was, one is, no one thought that Boeing would ever be able to come into the commercial airplane business. It was a market that was dominated by Douglas aircraft, and Boeing was a long-range bomber builder. And so, when Mark Allen went to the board of directors, by the way, he was an attorney. He was not an engineer, knew nothing about airplanes, just had been around the Boeing company for a very long time. And when he decided that he was going to go all in on this airplane, it was a major, major bet. The day after they made that decision, we went all in, borrowed all the money we needed to, and started building this airplane. And the airplane wasn't without, and a couple of really interesting things. If you look at on the wings, you can see that the engines are on a pylon. It was the first engine that was hung from a pylon from an airplane. Well, I shouldn't say it was the first, but it was very unique. It wasn't the way that jets were traditionally put on airplanes. What makes that a really great thing is, one is you can put fuel in the wing, and fuel in the wing is a big deal as far as the distance that you can travel with that. The second part of it is that when an airplane hits the ground and potentially a wing touches the ground, the engine will fall off, as opposed to the wing breaking off. If the wing breaks off, it's you're having a really, really bad day. So the other thing is it was the swept wing. So traditionally the wings were even with basically perpendicular. But this had a swept wing, which makes some really interesting challenges around the wing joint. But again, we had pioneered some of the technology here. And then lastly was control surfaces on the wing and also the rudder that made a difference to that airplane. One other point, it had what we call tricycle landing gear, which had a front landing gear and two in the back. A lot of planes had two in the front and one in the back. So anyway, it was very, very novel, very disruptive, and it was an all-in bet. And just as a supply chain guy, and by the way, I've lived through some of this with other airplanes we've introduced, that a couple of challenging problems that happened with that airplane. By the way, one other point, traditionally these kind of airplanes that were going this fast on landing had a parachute that would actually be the method of drag to actually stop the plane. So you'd hit the ground, launch a parachute, it would stop you. This airplane had a thrust reverser, so you could actually change the direction of the thrust and change it in the opposite direction so that you could, again, force air out the front and stop the airplane in a commercial landing space. So about 6,000 feet of runway was that airplane could land on. Most of them, the bombers needed about 10,000 feet. Now, when we built that airplane, there's a guy by the name of Tex Johnson that was the first pilot of the airplane. And he really lived up to the legacy of being Tex in the fact that that plane had all kinds of fun problems. One time they were doing high-speed practice takeoffs, and the front landing gear broke off. He got out of the plane and he said, "Thank God we learned that before I was up in the air." But the next time, the brakes went out. The brake line went out. They caught the gears caught on fire. There was no brakes, and he had to actually run it off into some mud. It got out of the plane again. He said, "Can we have it flying again in the next week?" And sure enough, we did. The last thing that's really fascinating about Tex Johnson is the Boeing company. There was a conference, an aerospace conference in Seattle, and he knew that was going on. Mark Allen was there, and they were really going to start pressing the airplane, and they were going to fly the airplane over that and show that people could that the airplane was all it was stacked up to be. And he said, well, I'm really going to prove that that's the case. And he actually, in flight, he did what's called a barrel roll. At a barrel roll in a big airplane like that, it holds 200 passengers. And by the way, that's $16 million. It's the entire Boeing company is flying in that airplane, and he does a barrel roll. And it's funny because Mark Allen, up until they said he fired Tex 1,000 times before the next morning because of that stunt that he did. And Tex said, you know what? If you want to impress your customers, you really need to impress your customers. If these are going to be Boeing customers, we really need to show them that there's something about what we do that makes us special. So to fast forward, we sold 1,000 of those airplanes. We didn't get any orders actually for the first 2 months. So Mark Allen and Tex both didn't feel that great. But we eventually sold 1,000 of these airplanes. There's still over 100. It's a 707 today. It was called the Dash 80 at launch. We made 700 odd tanker aircraft out of that. There's still over 500 of those aircraft flying today. So what is that? What is that? So from a supply chain perspective too, by the way, we've done this. We've done this on the 707. We did this on the 747, and we did it on the 787. And I don't know how many of you guys know what the 787 is, but the 787 is our most recent genre of aircraft. It's a fully composite aircraft. Complete game changer for the industry for us. And if you go look in literature, you'll find all kinds of negative stories about Boeing and the 787 and the supply chain, and how colossal of a failure it was of the supply chain. But the fact is that you would have said the same thing about the Dash 80. You would have said the same thing about the 747. The 747, once again, the Boeing company bet the entire enterprise on launching that airplane, and we did it, and it wasn't without its problems. And you know, it's what's kind of fun and interesting about this is landing gear and tires are just, I mean, the fact is landing gear and tires, one is, so just so you guys feel better about this, they are very, there's a lot of redundancy in those systems. They tend not to break to the point where you're going to have a bad experience, but they do tend to break. They get very hot. They're exposed to incredible amounts of heat, incredible amounts of cold. Tires are super high pressure. A lot of them blow on landing. You just don't know it because there's a lot of tires on an airplane. And for a supply chain guy, it's a disaster. I mean, every day you're getting some kind of wheel or tire or brake problem. One day I had supply chain for the defense side of the business. One day we have the Blue Angels, which is like this, which was one of these flying teams that the U.S. Navy has. And a guy calls me and he says, we need a tire for one of the Blue Angels. He just landed, he had a tire go out, and we need to give him a tire. And I said, well, I don't really have authorization to give them a tire. They go, well, they're the Navy's tires, right? And I go, they're the Navy's tires, but not the Blue Angels tires. So they're like, no, get them a tire. You need to give them that tire. And so we had a tire, got the tire, got it inflated, got it out to them. They were absolutely delighted that we were able to get the plane back up. 2 days later, a government order comes in and says, you're short a tire. I said, yeah, one of the Blue Angels came in and they said they needed it. And they said, yeah, but you weren't supposed to give it to them. And I said, no, that was not. You guys are the Navy, right? It's the Navy here, Navy there. Like, no, it's not. We're all not the same Navy. So suffice it to say that I had all kinds of political issues to deal with as a result of that. But that's a day in and day out kind of a problem that we get to deal with. I mean, I have to say it's a luxury for me to have to deal with those kind of problems in the job I do. So I think, though, this Dash 80 kind of epitomizes what the Boeing company is. Our motto is we connect, we protect, and we inspire the world. And we also say we're a global industrial champion. And I think the Dash 80 kind of epitomizes that. So who we are by the numbers, $94.5 billion company. We operate in over 150 countries. We're the largest exporter in the United States. We're the second largest importer. We have over 20,000 suppliers. We have a supplier in this room. So Brian here is one of our suppliers. And that's a lot of suppliers. If you count our SKUs, I wouldn't even want to give you the number of SKUs that we have in terms of our manufacturing because it's a ton. And again, and most of those parts come from suppliers in the supply base. 150,000 employees in 65 countries. We have people in South Africa. We have people all over the world. And 70% of our commercial revenue comes from outside of the United States. So we are a very big, very diverse organization. It's again, it's an absolute blessing to work there. It's a fascinating company to work within. We don't just do commercial, we do defense, we do space, we do actually cyber technology. We run the gamut of the market in terms of, again, connecting and protecting the world. Where APICS is going next. So I think most of you guys have heard this, but APICS focuses on improving people. Through people, we improve supply chains. Through supply chains, we improve economies, and through economies, we improve the world. That's big aspiration. I think seems like a really big deal, but it really is a big deal, and we take it very seriously. And we have membership, we have research and publications, education and certification. How we change lives, that's a big deal. It's kind of taken on a lot of responsibility from our perspective, but it's pretty amazing when you think about it. It's not uncommon for, I think that it's a standard. In fact, I would bet that in almost every executive board meeting that goes on in enterprise today, supply chain gets mentioned. It's a big deal. Now that said, it doesn't mean that we have good representation at events like this, nor does it mean we're getting all the right education, that people are participating the way they need to. Our aspiration is that we want to hit 100% of all supply chain people and drive education, drive knowledge, drive research, drive standards. Those are really, really important to us as an organization within APICS. And where we are going in terms of our future is, we talked about the rise and how do we focus on the rise and connecting the rise with things that we can do as an organization. How we do digital, how we do research, and how we embed ourselves in the academic community is a really important part of where we're going. It's not all about certification. And by the way, so you get a certification, the problem with that, it's like a degree. You get it and you're done. But the supply chain changes every day. What digital looks like today is going to be different than what digital looks like tomorrow. And so maintaining currency in our content is a huge, huge deal for us. We're going to be putting a lot more time and energy into that. And then also engaging with the academic community to help continue to push that forward. Use the SCORE model, continue to push that forward, and continue to develop that. SCORE 12 is out. Does everybody know SCORE 12? Most people have been very impressed with what SCORE 12 is doing, or what we'll be able to do, but we're not done. And unfortunately, I felt like when I first joined the board of directors of APICS, that sometimes we felt done, and it really troubled me. And I really created, hopefully I really helped drive a sense towards we're never going to be done. We have to be constantly paranoid about people won't ever know enough about supply chain, and we cannot feel like we're close enough. So that's really kind of this drive to innovation, drive to getting a true digital kind of a methodology and footprint. Also engaging in STEM, so postgraduate or graduate type of education or undergraduate education, getting to people long before they get into school grade. So, question now is, how will you ensure your workforce can advance, innovate, and transform your supply chain? So, I got a minute and a half still, which is still some time, right? I did want to give some time, if anybody had any questions, to throw that out there, give you guys some time to ask me what you might want to ask me.
We probably got time for one question.
This is it. Pressure's on. You have to have the perfect question now.
No?
No?
Not today.
All right. Thank you, guys.